Hey everyone, I hope you join me for my first video talking about why I love Donald Miller's book Scary Close. And I want to share this video and two more about essentially the key elements for me in the book. There's key elements I'm sure for everybody else, but there were a few elements for me that really resonated. And I think because I've spent a lot of my time now and full time, I'm a marriage and family therapist, these elements jumped out at me as far as key areas that help transform someone's life. And the first thing that Don really starts talking about is just kind of how we are shaped and formed by our prior experiences, really family of origin issues. And I think a lot of us sometimes don't realize that the experiences that we've had growing up, they affect who we are today. But a lot of times in counseling, people come to my office and they're like, Rhett, we're not going to talk about my mom today, are we? Or my parents, or about something that happened to me when I was 10, right? And I say, yeah, we're not going to talk about it if it's not maybe relevant, but a lot of this stuff is important. And who you were and who you are right today is often shaped by those things. Don talks about an experience he had when he was 7 years old that shaped who he was in many ways. And what we know now, especially through a lot of the brain science studies, is that somewhere between the ages of 6 and 16, our brain, when it experiences a certain feeling, say unloved, not important, not good enough, don't measure up, inadequate, a failure, unworthy, that feeling is so painful we have to figure out ways to cope with that. And sometimes we shut down, or we withdraw, or we become critical, or we become anxious or depressed, or become a perfectionist, right? And we repeat that pattern enough, that feeling gets triggered enough, we cope enough that this pattern starts to form. In fact, in some of the literature, some of the neuroscience scientists just call it a rut, essentially, this rut that forms in our brain. And we form these habits. We form such habits, such strong habits that I've learned something maybe when I was 10 years old, and I carried into my marriage into our 30s and our 40s and our 50s, so that when my wife and I are in conflict, for example, it's not really us who's arguing, our a 40-year-old version of ourselves. It's our 15-year-old version of ourselves or our 12-year-old version of ourselves. That's how powerful these are. In fact, even a couple months ago, I was at a workshop on the brain and all the latest studies and kind of what's going on in the field of neuroscience, and they said we're learning now that even 0 to 10 months shapes who we are in relationship to other people. And so I love how Don goes back and he connects that. And he talks specifically about the role of anxiety and how anxiety drove a lot of who he was. And for those out there who know me, I've written a book called The Anxious Christian, and I think anxiety can be a really helpful tool in helping us grow in our lives, right? It can be a catalyst, I think, that helps us grow. Often I compare it to the engine lights on your car that blink and say basically, hey, pay attention to me. Oil's low, tire pressure's low, engine's gonna burn out. If we don't pay attention to that, the car ends up on the side of the road. When you and I don't pay attention to the lights going off inside of our lives, like the light of anxiety, we end up burned out on the side of the road in our own personal lives. And so anxiety, I often think, is God's way to say, hey, something is going on. Pay attention to it. Take heed. And to learn to do something different with that anxiety. Anxiety becomes really negative when we just bury it and don't want to deal with it. But if we can acknowledge it, it can be this huge opportunity to see what's going on in the interior of our lives and to use it as an opportunity to grow. And so I love how Don dives back into family of origin issues and how he was shaped and formed and how the role of anxiety had a huge grasp on his life and how he learned to work through that. And I think that's critical. I think in everybody that I work with in my office, we talk about the role of family of origin and other relationships and how they've shaped us, but also the role of anxiety and how that drives us. So many of us experience anxiety. And currently I'm doing some work with Terry Hargrave, who is a professor at Fuller Theological Seminary, and he's got a model called restoration therapy, and he talks about that pattern of when feelings get triggered, negative feelings, and we cope negatively, essentially as being this pain cycle. And I was thinking about that as Don was writing this book, where Don is identifying this pain cycle that we're all stuck in, often driven by anxiety. And so it just resonated with me. And I think about that in terms of that pain cycle too, in terms of biblical terms, and Paul's words in Ephesians 4, that there's this old self that we're kind of captive to at times, and we have to be aware of it. We got to take ownership of it. And I'm glad that Don brought this up, because I think as readers read his book, they will start to hopefully ask themselves questions and get a sense of awareness around, where am I getting stuck? What am I feeling, and how do I behave? And it's only then, until we actually become aware of our behavior, that we can actually change it. You see, a lot of us go into relationships and we're so unaware of what we're doing, we just repeat destructive cycle after destructive cycle, and have one bad relationship after another. And so I like that Don highlights this so that you can become aware of your stuff. You can own it. You can take responsibility. It's not someone else's to fix it. It's for us to fix. That's a huge piece there in the early on in the book. And so really appreciate that piece. So anyways, join me for the next video.